The grand ballroom of the royal palace shimmered with crystal chandeliers and soft classical music as guests in designer suits and couture gowns filled the room. Laughter echoed, champagne glasses clinked, and everything looked perfect until Daniel walked in. At 35, Daniel stood out immediately. Not because he was underdressed, his suit was clean, pressed, and elegant, but because it lacked the flashy designer labels everyone else seemed desperate to display. He had driven more than 3 hours from the capital just to attend this wedding. Now, standing at the entrance, he wondered if coming had been a mistake. "Excuse me, sir, invitation?" The security guard blocked his path, even as other guests walked past freely. Daniel calmly handed over the invitation. Thick paper, gold edges, embossed lettering. The guard studied it far too long, flipping it over like he expected it to be fake. Finally, with visible reluctance, he stepped aside. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence as Daniel walked through the hall. Groups subtly repositioned themselves, leaving awkward gaps of empty space around him. Whispers followed him like shadows. "Do you know who that is?" "I've never seen him before." Daniel pretended not to hear. He approached a table near the back and pulled out a chair. Before he could sit, a well-dressed woman hurried over. "I'm sorry, these seats are reserved for the groom's family." There was no sign, no name cards, nothing. "No problem," Daniel replied politely, moving on. The same thing happened again, and again, and again. Each time, the excuses were thinner, the stares colder. Eventually, he found a lone chair near the service exit. No one complained there. The waiters passed him multiple times with champagne trays, never offering him a glass. When he finally raised his hand, one server nervously muttered, "I'll check if we have any left," and vanished for nearly 20 minutes. Daniel smiled faintly. During the ceremony, the pattern continued. Guests greeted one another warmly, except him. Group photos formed and reformed without anyone inviting Daniel to join. It was as if he existed only when someone felt uncomfortable. The bride, Amanda, glowing in a white lace gown, moved through the crowd greeting guests. When her eyes met Daniel's, she froze. Her smile vanished. Without a word, she turned away and walked in the opposite direction. Daniel noticed everything. He didn't look angry. He looked patient. Because people who carry dangerous secrets don't rush the moment. They wait for it. Outside, Daniel finally found peace. He pulled out his phone and typed, "I've arrived." The reply came instantly. "Document everything." He did. Every whisper, every insult, every calculated exclusion. That's when the bride's mother appeared. "This is a private event," she snapped. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm just getting some air," Daniel replied calmly. She laughed. "You don't belong in our circle. I suggest you leave before this becomes unpleasant." More guests gathered. The familiar formation. Judgment masked as concern. Then the groom appeared. "I know you," he said slowly, staring at Daniel. "From somewhere." Daniel held his gaze. "I don't think so." But the recognition had already landed. Minutes later, the situation spiraled. Threats turned official. Names were dropped. The sheriff was called. And then everything collapsed. When the sheriff entered and saw Daniel, his face went pale. "Sir?" "Advocate Washington." The room went silent. Daniel stepped forward, calm but commanding. "Daniel Washington, U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division." Gasps filled the room. Federal agents entered. Warrants were read. Accusations laid bare. Housing discrimination, bribery, falsified records. The bride broke down. The groom stepped away. The powerful became powerless. The wedding wasn't a celebration anymore. It was a crime scene. 6 months after the wedding that was never meant to end this way, the truth had fully surfaced. Coleman Enterprises officially filed for bankruptcy. Federal courts confirmed decades of systematic discrimination hidden behind polished brochures and luxury housing ads. Contracts were exposed, emails decrypted, and bank accounts frozen. The empire that once decided who was worthy of opportunity no longer existed. Amanda Coleman stood before a federal judge, no longer in a white dress, but in silence. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. Her law license was permanently revoked. Colonel Coleman, once feared and respected, spent his final public days watching his reputation collapse under the weight of evidence he could no longer deny. The man who believed power placed him above accountability learned too late that justice has a longer memory than privilege. The groom annulled the marriage within weeks. He left the state quietly, avoiding cameras, carrying the shame of discovering that love built on lies eventually destroys everything around it. The Grand Palace Ballroom closed its doors forever after federal investigators uncovered years of discriminatory practices against staff and guests. The chandeliers were turned off. The music stopped. Silence replaced arrogance. Daniel Washington stood in his office in Washington, D.C., watching the evening news without emotion. Headlines scrolled across the screen. Historic civil rights case reshapes housing policy nationwide. He reached for a framed photograph on his desk. 17 African American and Latino families stood proudly in front of newly built homes. Homes funded by money recovered from the Coleman investigation. Children smiled, barefoot on green lawns, holding keys their parents once believed they would never own. For them, justice wasn't a courtroom word. It was a front door. Letters arrived daily. Former employees. Families once rejected. Even children writing thank you notes in shaky handwriting. One letter stood out. Because of what you did, my daughter will grow up believing the world is fair. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Months later, Daniel returned briefly to the same city. The streets looked unchanged, but the system beneath them was not. At a community housing opening, a familiar face approached him. Thomas, the waiter who once ignored him at the wedding. I didn't understand back then, Thomas said quietly. Now I do. Dignity doesn't come from status. It comes from how you treat people. Daniel nodded. That was enough. At that wedding, they tried to erase him with silence. They tried to shrink him with exclusion. They tried to humiliate him with whispers. Instead, they revealed themselves. Their prejudice became evidence. Their arrogance became testimony. Their cruelty became the foundation of their downfall. Justice didn't shout that night. It listened. It recorded. And when the time was right, it spoke. Because real justice doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives prepared. And when it does, it doesn't just punish. It changes lives. If this story moved you, remember this. Your worth is not defined by how others treat you, but by what the truth reveals about them. Subscribe for more powerful stories where patience defeats prejudice and justice always finds its way.